The mythology of the indigenous peoples of the area asserts that the god of thunder lives within the falls. The name that they bear today, Niagara Falls, is based on a Native American word that means literally a thundering noise. And so you can imagine how disconcerting it was for residents of the area just after midnight on March 30th, 1848, when the thunder suddenly stopped. It was an epic battle of the elements, of wind and water and ice, that caused the extraordinary day when Niagara Falls ran dry. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Niagara Falls, Canada, speculates that Niagara Falls are approximately 12,000 years old. Retreating glaciers created the Great Lakes, and the falls were created when water moving downhill between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario passed over a steep cliff called the Niagara Escarpment. The falls are spectacular not merely for their height. In fact, they are, the New York State Museum notes, far from the highest waterfall in the world, or even in New York. Rather, the falls are particularly spectacular because of the volume of the flow. The museum continues. However, the rush of over 6 million cubic feet of water per minute, approaching the cascade at about 25 miles per hour and plunging 70 to 190 feet across the distance of 3,000 feet, make it one of the natural wonders of the world. There is disagreement over who the first Europeans were who encountered Niagara Falls. Explorer Jacques Cartier may have been told of the falls by indigenous peoples during an expedition in 1535, and Europeans may have viewed the falls as early as 1604 when an expedition under the command of Frenchman Samuel de Champlain explored Canada. A description and engraving of the falls were included in a book by French priest Louis Hennepin, who may have viewed the falls in 1678. That engraving, however, is not an accurate rendition, and Hennepin's described the falls as being more than 3 times their actual height. British Army officer and naturalist Thomas Davies painted a watercolor of the falls following the French and Indian War. The watercolor, painted in 1762, is generally thought to be the first eyewitness, accurate rendition of the falls. The economic potential of the river and the falls was recognized early. A French army officer named Daniel Joncaire first diverted a channel to power a watermill above the falls in 1750. The American Art Museum of the Smithsonian Institution notes that since the beginning of the 19th century, landowners and entrepreneurs have been busy developing flashy amusements, hotels, and facilities for tourists, as well as constructing large mills and factories, all of which encroached upon the riverbanks of the falls. The historical marker database notes that in 1805, New York State sold the land around the falls, and mills and other businesses that used the Niagara River for power were established. These industries provided the local community with needed services, helping the area to prosper. The Niagara River represented the boundary between the state of New York and the province of Upper Canada and saw much fighting during the War of 1812. It was again the scene of fighting in 1837 in what was called the Caroline Affair, when the U.S. steamer Caroline was used to move men supporting an armed Canadian independence movement. British troops crossed the river, captured the steamer, and set fire to it above the falls. The boat broke up and went over the falls. The incident caused a diplomatic row between the U.S. and Britain, but it was resolved with the Webster-Ashburn Treaty in 1842. A staircase down the American side of Table Rock was built in the 1820s, and ferry service was operating across the river during that decade. In September 1846, a 78-foot sidewheel steamer called the Maid of the Mist was christened. The boat was named after a Native American legend about a young woman saved from going over the falls by the Thunder God. At the time, the steamer, which could carry 100 people, was not intended as a tourist boat to view the falls, but a link in a ferry service between New York and Toronto. It was only after the ferry business was taken away with the construction of the first suspension bridge, later in 1848, that the owners of the Maid of the Mist had the idea of using the boat to take tourists closer to the falls. The natural beauty of the falls attracted famous visitors, whose reports added to the area's reputation. Smithsonian Magazine writes that a visit to Niagara Falls was practically a religious experience. "When I felt how near to my Creator I was standing," Charles Dickens wrote in 1842, "the first effect, and the enduring one, instant lasting, of the tremendous spectacle, was peace." Alexis de Tocqueville described a profound and terrifying obscurity on his visit in 1831. The falls were already becoming associated with the newly developing tradition of honeymooning. The tradition of the honeymoon following the wedding began in England and originally represented a trip taken by a newly married couple to visit relatives who were unable to attend the wedding ceremony. The first known honeymoon to be taken at Niagara Falls was that of wealthy South Carolinian Joseph Alston and Theodosia Burr, daughter of U.S. Vice President Aaron Burr, in 1801. In 1804, the falls were visited by another pair of newlyweds, Baltimore heiress Elizabeth Patterson and Jerome Bonaparte, younger brother of the French emperor. Their marriage is the subject of another episode of The History Guy. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 made the falls more accessible, spurring both trade and making the location more accessible to the middle class, allowing the area to develop the reputation as a place for honeymooners. Niagara Falls Tourism quotes an 1839 newspaper reporter, "I have counted several cooing couples near the falls, both Canadian and Americans, fulfilling the fleeting period of their honey lunacy." The first version of the famous Clifton Hotel on the Canadian side of the falls was built in 1835. The hotel, and another built on the site after the first hotel burned in 1898, would be an iconic place for honeymooners for nearly a century, before the second hotel was destroyed by fire in 1933. Thus, Niagara Falls was a bustling place in 1848. The town of Niagara, New York, had a population of 1,277, according to the 1840 census. Factories and mills along the river used the power of the water, while visitors and honeymooners enjoyed the natural beauty of the falls. Then, just after midnight on March 29th, the roar stopped. The Buffalo Express wrote on the 30th, "Last night, at 11 o'clock, the factories fed from the waters of this majestic river were in full operation, and at 12 o'clock, the water was suddenly shut off. The wheels suddenly ceased their evolutions, and everything was hushed into silence, except a faint roar of the maddened waters of the Niagara." Nothing like this had ever happened before. The Express writes, "When the facts were made known, astonishment could be seen pictured on the countenances of all." According to a 2017 article in the Buffalo News, newspapers and historical accounts say that the first person to notice the astounding event was a farmer from Niagara Falls named Jed Porter, who went out for a stroll around midnight near the falls and heard silence. In his 1993 book, The Day Niagara Ran Dry, meteorologist D.W. Phillips writes, "Residents first realized that something was wrong when they were awakened by an overpowering, eerie silence. Inspection of the river by torches revealed only a few puddles of water in the riverbed." The Niagara Falls New York Iris reported that Table Rock and some 200 yards more was left dry. Islands and places where the foot of man never dared to tread have been visited, flags placed upon them, and mementos brought away. According to a 1997 article in the Buffalo News, one of those flags was placed by a miller named Samuel Street, who lived on the Canadian side of the river. The paper reports that he discovered that his water wheel had stopped. With his daughter, Street walked midway across the top of the Horseshoe Falls and fixed a small flag near the brink. The Buffalo Express wrote at the time, "To give you some idea of the lowness of the water, Messrs. George Hamlin and Woodruff this morning rode in a buggy 1/3 of the way across the river, from the head of Goat Island towards the Canada shore. The wheeling was excellent, the rock being as a floor. They drove around the outside of the island known as Allen's Island and turned around, a thing which has never before occurred." The paper reported with astonishment, "The falls around Niagara can be compared to nothing but a mere mill dam. In the memory of the oldest inhabitants, never was there so little water running over Niagara's awful precipice as at this moment." The news reports, "Fish perished. Turtles were stranded." Word spread quickly. The Express wrote that hundreds of people are now witnessing that which never has, and probably may never again be witnessed, on the Niagara River. All the people of the neighborhood were abroad, exploring recesses and cavities that had never been exposed to mortal eyes. The writer went some distance up the shore of the river where huge fields of muddy bottom were laid bare. Phillips writes that 5,000 sightseers from as far away as Hamilton and Buffalo jammed the roads to Niagara Falls and converged on the riverbank to see the phenomenon. The news writes that as word spread, sightseers swarmed in from nearby cities and towns. After sunset, hundreds of people reportedly lined up and carried torches along the brinks of the American and Horseshoe Falls. The event was truly baffling and found meaning in an area of the country that was still experiencing the religious revival called the Second Great Awakening. The website Wired wrote in 2010, "Was it the end of the world? Divine retribution for what some folks thought was a U.S. war of aggression against Mexico?" Theological explanations abounded, because Western New York State had been a burned-over district for half a century, with recurring waves of religious revivals and the rise of several new denominations and religions. The term burned-over district referred to areas of New York where the fires of religiosity from the Second Great Awakening took place to such a great extent that spiritual fervor seemed to set the area on fire. Wired continues, "Thousands of people filled the churches to attend special services. They prayed for the falls to start flowing and the world to continue, or for salvation and forgiveness of their sins as the Last Judgment approached." Phillips writes that for superstitious people, the unusual silence and unexplained phenomenon was a portent of divine wrath or impending doom. But while some prayed, others saw opportunity. Phillips writes that while thousands stood in disbelief, a few daredevils explored recesses and cavities at the bottom of the Dry River Gorge, never before visible. They picked up bayonets, muskets, swords, tomahawks, and other relics of the War of 1812. The news writes that the U.S. cavalry joined the parade, riding their horses back and forth across the riverbed. There was economic opportunity as well. The news writes that enterprising youths with a logging cart removed some 40 to 60-foot-long pine timbers from the vicinity of Three Sisters Islands. The captain of the Maid of the Mist offered a reward for any who could take advantage of the opportunity to remove stones that had repeatedly threatened the boat. The Iris reported. Judge Porter, with his troops of blasters under the active and efficient foreman James McAfee, was early in the canals leading to mills and factories, where the thunder of their blast was heard all day on a spot where heretofore the rushing waters forbade too near an approach. They worked safely on dry ground. Rocks which at very low water sometimes touched the keel of the steamer Maid of the Mist, and for which the captain had made liberal offers for their removal, were yesterday blown to pieces and removed with the same ease as though it was on dry land. The reason for the stoppage was particularly perplexing. As the Express noted, the stage of the water is frequently changed by strong northwest gales that force the water into the lake towards its western extremity. But a fall so unparalleled, and at a time when severe storms are but seldom known, and while the weather is so exceedingly mild and propitious here? Stopping the falls is a rather extraordinary feat by any measure. The website of Niagara Falls State Park writes that 3,160 tons of water flows over Niagara Falls every second. This accounts for 75,750 gallons of water per second over the American and Bridal Veil Falls, and 681,750 gallons per second over the Horseshoe Falls. The falls are the most powerful waterfall in North America. The physics website Socratic Q&A did the math in 2015. If all the energy of the falling water could be harnessed by a single hydroelectric power plant, it would produce a mind-numbing 2,881.2 million watts of power per second. The explanation for the power that was making that happen took some time to reach the area. Wired writes that the telegraph was still a new invention. Railroads served towns on both sides of the river, but the tracks were unreliable, and Buffalo, the nearest big city, was 3 hours away even when the trains ran on schedule. But it was from Buffalo that the word eventually arrived that explained the Bear Falls and Dry Riverbed. Strong southwest gale winds had pushed huge chunks of lake ice to the extreme northeastern tip of Lake Erie, blocking the lake's outlet into the head of the Niagara River. It seems reasonable that such a large ice dam would have been the result of a particularly harsh winter, but that was not the case. Phillips writes that the winter of 1847-48 was not intensely cold, and Lake Erie's ice cover was not thicker than usual. In fact, that particular winter was about 2 degrees milder than usual. In fact, the ice was breaking up, but as is common in March, Phillips notes that normally by the end of March the lake is clear except for the eastern wind near Buffalo, where prevailing winds and water currents concentrated drifting ice. Western winds blowing down nearly 400 kilometers of open water breaks the ice into mammoth chunks and remold it into ridges and rafters of ice. All of that is common, but the unique event that caused the falls to run dry in 1848 was simply a shift in the wind. The wind shifted the opposite direction and propelled the mass of ice south and west. Phillips writes that the combined force of winds, waves, and lake currents jammed hundreds of thousands of tons of ice into a solid dam at the neck of the lake. But of course, such a dam couldn't hold. After some 30 hours, the Buffalo News writes, shortly after nightfall on March 31st, after the wind shifted to the opposite direction and weakened the impromptu ice dam, the pressure from pent-up Lake Erie sent a wall of water cascading down the river and surging over the falls with a mighty roar. And so Niagara Falls ran dry for 30 hours, 175 years ago. So how important is that really? Well, here's one interesting measure. It had never happened before, and it has never happened since. Never in any other time in recorded human history have the conditions come together so that an ice dam literally blocked Niagara Falls. It was so extraordinary that Phillips notes that 30 years after the event, surviving eyewitnesses were being asked to sign declarations attesting to the fact that they were there the day that the Falls of Niagara ran dry. And Phillips writes that it's unlikely to ever happen again, because now, in winter, we erect an ice boom that's designed to prevent ice dams in order to protect hydroelectric plants. Of course, some people might know that the falls sometimes freeze over, but in fact, while ice can be thick enough to walk across, the river and falls still run strongly underneath. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dewatered the American Falls in 1969 using a cofferdam with the goal of studying the falls and erosion. But that was just the American Falls, which represent just 1/10 of the water that goes over the Canadian Horseshoe Falls. Only once has its mighty roar been stilled, Phillips writes, on that memorable March night in 1848. There are no known photographs of the day that the Falls of Niagara ran dry. The Buffalo News notes that no one still alive remembers this phenomenon, and so we have to accept the evidence of our forebears who lived on the Niagara frontier in that cold winter of 1848. And in the echoes of their words, we have the only story of an event that appears to have been absolutely unique. A day when the awesome power of nature was held back by the awesome power of nature. It is an example of truth, stranger than fiction, and history that deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.